Hello and welcome back to Calathea. In the last episode, we built this unique factory industry area at the south of the map and did a massive overhaul on the cargo transport network in the city. This involved adding a cargo train station to every single industry area and connecting them all with an internal track. This station in the middle of this industry area can be used by both internal and external cargo trains, and it's made a massive improvement to the traffic flow on the roads of this city so far. Intersections that were once backed up for miles are now completely clear, and it means that all of the trucks that would have had to have travelled from one side of the map to the other on the roads to deliver goods can now do that on the tracks instead. There's a bunch of unique factories down here, including electronics, sneakers, cars, toys, crammed as many as we could into this space. There's also a few unique buildings, some generic industry and some offices. We also built this second unique factory area. This one has much larger assets and they're much more of an eyesore than the other industry area, but it's sandwiched in between the oil and ore areas. And those two industry types already have large assets, so I thought it would be more appropriate to have them up here. There's also some unique buildings and a couple of warehouses in here too. These two builds used a lot of assets that I wouldn't have used anywhere else in Calathea, so it was nice to work with a bit of variety. We've had a name suggestion for the tourism district on the other side of the hills. Point Me at the Sky 124 suggested calling this district Duchess Bay, and I really like that name. They're exactly right, Calathea does feel like a place that would have a duchess, and I think this is exactly where she would live. So our tourism district over here will now be known as Duchess Bay. In today's episode, we're going to be breaking ground on the super high-rise area of Calathea. This piece of land down here is going to be full of super high-rise offices, IT buildings, and a small amount of residential. I've downloaded a bunch of assets from the workshop for this to make sure we have a variety of skyscrapers, and like I mentioned at the end of the last episode, I am going to be putting public transport into this district, and we may even try out a monorail. Getting this piece of land to be usable took quite a lot of flattening, and there is a weird kind of chasm, old dried up river, and a bunch of rocks in this bit that connects it to the mainland. So I think what I might do to make this a little bit more interesting is turn these two ditches into rivers and kind of flatten the land out so the water can flow between them. And then this piece here will be almost like a little mini island, and then I'll put a bridge going across it from the mainland. Kind of like Roosevelt Island in New York, but on a much smaller scale. Now we have a tiny island that sits in between the mainland and the super high-rise island. Like I said, there's going to be a bridge going over from the mainland to this island. I'm going to make sure that I use one with a really nice bridge style, so it's going to be fairly raised as it comes in, a little bit like the bridges coming into Manhattan. I'm going to put the road plan in and then walk you through what I've got planned. So this is the very large roadmap that I'm going to start with. This area is huge, but luckily it's going to be filled with really big assets and there's going to be a lot of repetition, so it shouldn't take too long to fill. The grid structure felt like the right thing to do for this kind of area because there's going to be a lot of very large, tall buildings with very squared edges. The inner cities are almost always in grids, so they can fit as much in as possible. I guess this build is kind of inspired by places like New York with that densely packed big city kind of feel. So when it comes to the zoning of this district, I'm going to try and keep all the residential builds closer to this end of the district. There's going to be some lower income housing around where this massive bridge comes in, and then some nicer, more high class buildings down here. By putting the residential buildings on this side rather than this side, they'll look out over to the sea. They'll have a nicer view out this way and less disruption and noise pollution. I've left some larger blocks for things like parks and unique buildings, and then I'm going to have the offices down this end and on this side of the district. This area down here is going to be a bit more multi-purpose, with some high-density housing, some facilities, and some smaller office assets. I've left this bit on the end empty on purpose, just in case there's a large asset that I want to put in this district. I don't want to have to be bulldozing roads to do it, so I'll come to this part at the very end. So I'm going to start with the residential end of the district because housing is still the highest demand, and then I'll move through to the multi-use area and then onto the IT side. So let's get building. So I think this is all of the low income high density that I want to do for this district. Maybe a few of these assets peppered into other areas, but I'm going to use them in different ways so that they don't necessarily look this run down. So now I'm going to transition into the nicer high density area. I don't want there to be just a stark difference between the two, so I'm going to kind of try and blend it as best as I can. And these unique building assets here and here are really handy for this because they look like apartment blocks, but they're actually parks. So it doesn't necessarily matter if they're placed on a main road, and they provide a massive entertainment boost to the whole area. So I'm probably going to be using a few of these around just to kind of blend these two areas together. So I've got a decent way into this district so far, and I'm going to take a break from the building for a moment to walk you through what I've done so far and to plan out the public transport routes. Put a tiny bit of industry back here as well, along with a park and another whole park block. And then the transition into the high rise and the multi-use area has started with some much taller buildings, and then I've peppered in some medium heights, some high ones, and then some commercial over here as well. These are kind of all a little bit all over the place with these units, but I feel like this is very reminiscent of streets in New York where the buildings follow a vague common theme. They're all different sizes, different heights, different colours, and it's very obvious that they were designed by a bunch of different people. There's also an expo centre back here with a bunch of parking, and I put a pedestrian road through the back so I could put some more commercial buildings down here. It does clip a little bit because a lot of these people are waiting outside the expo centre. So there may be a little bit of overlap between the assets, but it's not that noticeable. Down here is a big secondary school block. I tried to fit as many of the sports related parks in as I could. So they've got a running track, a football field, and a couple of basketball courts. I did have to add a pedestrian road down here just to get the basketball courts in, but there was already a node there, so it hasn't added anything additional to this road. There's a huge department store down here, and I've left this part empty for a public transport station of some sort. There'll probably be a metro station here, possibly a bus station as well. That's why I need to stop building for a moment and think about where the public transport is going to go, because otherwise I'll fill every space and then have to remove stuff later on. Loads of office blocks down here. I've tried to keep these two blocks here fairly low rise with lots of nice looking but varied assets. So there's a lot of brick assets with loads of windows, and it's a mix of vanilla and custom ones. This is a unique building as well, so that will add entertainment to the area. And there's loads of the same assets pushed together in this block to create some modular units. Over here is a hospital. This is from the workshop, and there's just a car park on either side, and then a couple of the car parks with solar panel roofs, a little bit of an energy boost for the district. This district is pulling a huge amount of water and electricity, so I do have to be very mindful of how much pressure I'm putting on that. So any extra space that I can help the grid out with, I'm gonna put these little car parks down. Starting to get a little bit more high rise over here. These are mostly custom assets with a few vanilla ones here and there. It's a mix of offices and high density commercial. And again, a lot of these assets have kind of been pushed together to make larger ones. There's also some sunken plazas in the centre here. These two assets here mirror really nicely, and they have little plazas on the corners, but they weren't quite big enough to fill the whole block. So I put one of these one tile wide eco offices down the middle. There are windows facing a brick wall there, but from a distance you're not really going to notice that. And it looks like you can access the back of the building down the middle here as well. So this is going to get a lot more built up as we get down to this end of the district. And I'm talking skyscrapers and statement buildings. Most of them are going to be offices, but there are going to be some unique buildings and some residential as well. Because like always, residential is still the highest demand, and I don't want all of the commercial and offices and industry to remove themselves if we don't have enough people. So I'm going to continue the mixed use down this side of the district and basically have this side of the island for housing and commercial mainly, and then the other side for offices, but obviously I am going to mix things up a bit here and there. Some of these blocks are going to be used for parks just like this one, so it's not all going to be super dense buildings, but this is going to be a lot denser and a lot more crowded than any of the other districts we've done so far. So when it comes to public transport, there's going to be a huge amount of people living and working and visiting this district. So we're going to need to make sure that the system is robust. That means having multiple different forms of public transport going in and around and to and from this district. The lines we've already drawn on the metro system will work quite well for this district. We've got one line coming up this direction, and then we've got another line coming up this way. So this district is going to be very well serviced for metro to get back into the mainland. I'm also going to put a bus route or two going around the district, and like I mentioned before, I do want to put a monorail in as well. So the first thing I'm going to do is pull the metro lines up. Here's the metro network in this district. There's one line running north-south and one line running east-west. They each have 2 stops on them, and there should be a stop close enough to everyone that they can get to a metro station quite easily. Both of these lines actually go down to the same station in the main city area. I guess people can pick whichever one they want to use to get up here, but this white line will eventually have other stops up this way once that part of the city's been built out, so I'm sure that the travel habits will change over time. And now that those lines are in, hopefully people will start coming to this district via public transport instead, and that should stop the roads from getting too busy. Now that I've got a little bit more of this district built, I'm going to do another quick walkthrough of what I've done so far and let you know what's going to be coming up next. Obviously, there is a huge amount of housing in this district. We're over halfway now to the population for the Megapolis milestone, so this district has made a huge dent into that goal. But they're still demanding more, and obviously the more offices and commercial we put in, the more workers they're going to need, and the more facility buildings those residents are going to need. So it's one big cycle of having to not just put one thing in, but having to put everything in. There's a mid-rise block here with some vanilla and some custom assets, and a couple of unique buildings as well. I really like this kind of red brick building. It really reminds me of New York, and they have a few areas like this in Manhattan. You get these little clusters of the same building in an area, so I thought I'd kind of mimic that here. And I've tried to pull a few of the kind of grottier elements through with these vanilla assets. Over the road from here is the intelligence agency from the High Tech Buildings DLC. I've been meaning to use this in one of the districts so far, and none of them quite felt right, so this seemed like a perfect place to put it. Round the back is a multi-storey car park and some offices and high-density commercial buildings. I'm trying to step up the height as we get towards this end of the district, so you'll start to see a few more of these larger assets in here. It's a lot of repetition with the commercial and office buildings because we've only got a limited catalogue to be working with. I think I've looked at the workshop far too many times for this build, and I'm probably going to end up frying my computer if I keep downloading more assets. So I think I've managed to make it look varied enough that even though there are the same buildings popping up here and there, you won't really notice because it's got other stuff around it and it's always in a different setting. So there's a few of the IT offices here from the Eco Pack, and then some smaller ones back here. And I decided to do a few blocks of these modular houses because they hold a huge amount of people and they fill up blocks very, very easily. So I did kind of cheat a little bit and just copy and paste the blocks in here, but it saved a huge amount of time by not placing them manually. I made a very small industrial and electricity block back here because the electricity grid was really struggling and the power kept dipping out as I was building things, so I put 2 of these geothermal plants back here. So these nice industry buildings up the front here kind of mask it from the ground. You can kind of see the turrets popping over the top, but the front of these buildings are quite nice, so it's not so much of an eyesore. Also added some more buildings to the low income area just to finish off this side of the district. And over here is a primary school with a couple of car parks and a basketball field and some more low income housing. As you come down this main road, the fronts of the buildings all look really nice. I tried to make sure that the ones on the corners had detailing on both sides, whether it was a corner piece or not. So this did have a garbage can on the side and I removed it because I didn't want that to be the first thing you saw coming into this district. But I think it looks all right with what I've got so far. I also added another primary school back here. This is a really fancy one. It holds about 2,000 students. And with the number of people we've got living in this district so far, we're gonna need that. Last time I looked at the population stats for this district, we were sitting at 17,000 residents just in this one island. I reckon I might even need to add another primary school later on if the population gets super high. Here are some unique buildings. This is an art museum from the vanilla catalogue, and these 2 are unique buildings from the workshop. They kind of look like these residential buildings, but they add to the entertainment and land value of the buildings around it. And the last thing I'll mention before carrying on is this library. This is a beautiful building, and it's even got small amounts of detailing up here where you can see the tables and chairs up on the roof. Unfortunately, the light on this side isn't very good and it wouldn't fit in this block over here because of this road, but it does look amazing. It's quite the statement piece as you come out of this metro station. I also added a couple of restaurants alongside it because I didn't want to block how beautiful this building is, and then some offices down the back because the back of this building isn't anywhere near as special as the front or the sides. I'd say that we're probably about halfway done with this. This is definitely my most ambitious build to date, and I didn't quite know what I was getting myself in for when I started this. And I've actually had to do this over 2 sessions so far, and I may have to do a third if I can't get this all done tonight. It's going to be a ton of stuff that we haven't used anywhere else so far. Like I want to put in a sports stadium of some sort, loads more unique buildings, and obviously we're going to have the bus and monorail public transport as well. The road traffic really isn't that bad in this district. Like there's hardly any cars on the road at the moment, but the traffic getting into this district, that's where the problem is. I have to keep resetting the commercial buildings because they can't get the goods in because the trucks are stuck on the roads. I've tried to help the traffic flow as much as I can coming down to here, but unfortunately it is still quite backed up. So I do have to keep going around and resetting them, which is a pain, but it's what I get for building this much in one go. With the monorail, I'm going to keep it further up this end because that's going to be where more of the touristy stuff is, but I will kind of loop it back further here. So one of these roads back here will probably end up with a monorail on it by the end of the episode. But for now, I'm going to get stuck back into building. Okay, I am just about done with this build for today. This has been the longest build I think I've ever done in one go, and that probably explains why it's a bit all over the place. This district is massive. Got a population of over 23,000 just on this island alone, and has pretty much every single unique building that I have in the catalogue, plus loads of offices, housing, commercial, parks, facilities, and public transport. It's crazy to think that this building over here from the Green Cities pack is pretty much one of the tallest vanilla buildings you can have. And it is dwarfed by all of these huge skyscrapers around it. But that's exactly what I was going for. I wanted to have this kind of ridiculously huge, overbearing skyline. And the workshop came in clutch for this. There are so many really tall skyscrapers on there, both as offices and unique buildings. So most of the really tall buildings are a combination of those two things. So because the build for this district was so intensive, I haven't shown all of the building in a time lapse like I would normally do, but instead I'm going to do a really thorough walkthrough, partly because condensing that all down into an hour-long episode is impossible, but also I went back and changed things quite a few times, and I downloaded more assets or found something that would have been more appropriate or needed to add facilities in, so it doesn't necessarily look like what I started building with. So the mini walkthroughs that I did in the middle, it may look slightly different to what you saw in those, but it's still kind of along the same lines. So let me give you a tour. So let's start with our low income area of the district. This is the south end of the island, and it's where the bridge comes in from the rest of the city. And as you can see, the traffic is starting to get a little bit backed up now. That's kind of only happened within the last, I'd say, half hour of me building, because so far the traffic really hasn't been that bad. We've had a huge surge of people moving into this district, so I'm not surprised that the traffic is a little bit bad. But it's kind of adding to the aesthetic of this place really, because I didn't want this area to be super polished. I wanted it to be a little bit thrown together with some kind of more rundown buildings, lots of balconies, windows, very, very busy to the eye and not necessarily in a good way. But in terms of the actual stats of this area, they're less serviced by the facilities, but they actually have less noise pollution than the other end of the district, because they don't have as many offices, commercial or unique buildings or anything of that like to add to the noise pollution. They kind of just have the roads. So actually they might be doing better than people in other parts of the district. A lot of these buildings are kind of smushed together. I tried to use a lot of vanilla ones along with some from the workshop. These ones over here, like I mentioned before, are actually unique buildings, so no one's necessarily living on this main road, but they still look like houses. I love how these ones go underneath this bridge here. It's on both sides of the road, and I feel like that is kind of what would happen in a place like this where you've got limited land to build on and you need to use every single square inch of the place, so those assets fit perfectly underneath that bridge. There's a small recycling centre down here and a park over here as well. I wanted to give them a little bit of entertainment. They've got the unique buildings, but other than that they kind of just have car parks. So I put a park on the edge here because it actually looks out over a really nice part of this middle island. So that's kind of like the nice corner of this area. These assets here were a godsend when I found them. They're from the workshop and they're kind of corner pieces that slot together to make all sorts of interesting shapes. Because I set this district up like a grid, most of the roads here are at right angles, apart from pieces like this. So the majority of the buildings are in kind of square or rectangular formations. But I did put a pedestrian road through the centre of here, and I put a car park in the centre of each of these building blocks. A similar building style over here. These ones line the main boulevard, so I wanted them to look nice because this is the first thing you see as you come into the district. The front of these are very clean and they kind of make a nice rounded block. And then I moved the elementary school further back into this block and removed one of the car parks and kind of extended the houses all the way round. I didn't like the way that it looked before, and as that's one of the first things you see coming into the district, I thought it would be better off to be something more like this. Some taller buildings down the back here, they look out over the rest of the city on the mainland, which is quite nice, but they also have a view of the industrial corner. This is where the electricity sources are. They were really struggling at one point and the grid was being totally overloaded on this island because it's not connected up to the mainland in any way. They have to be self-sufficient. As we go this way, we start to transition into nicer houses. So these are a combination of vanilla and custom assets. They all have lots of greenery on them and lots of balconies, and they look out over the sea, so these flats would cost a bomb. A couple more modular blocks back here and a little secondary school complex with a couple of basketball courts, a football pitch and one of the athletic fields. The secondary school is nearly full with students and I may have to add in a second one at some point, but at the moment they're just about doing okay. I removed all of the residential buildings from this block here because they were constantly complaining about noise, and I'm not surprised. They were wall to wall with a bunch of commercial buildings and behind an expo centre. So I replaced all of the residential buildings with commercial ones and tried to make it look a little bit more thrown together. I also moved the tube station to over here near the expo centre so that I could put a bus station in here. This is the department store from the shopping malls pack, and this little bus station fit in here perfectly. There are 3 lines running through the city, and I'll go through where they are in a little bit more detail later on, but all of the buses will come back to here to pick people up. This building here is a unique building, and I thought it fit quite nicely on this corner because it actually has detailing going all the way around it. There's a kind of pseudo large park in the middle here that I made by joining up 2 of the small park with trees assets. I'm a little bit concerned about the housing in this area because they are surrounded by things that are very noisy and they have been complaining, which is why I tried to use a unique building as well, because that's at least one less residential building that's going to be affected by the noise. There's some smaller offices in this centre part. They're a combination of vanilla and custom assets. Then down here is the hospital with a couple of car parks on either side and some solar panel covered car parks down the back. These were originally 3 blocks of the same type of building, and I did just copy and paste them because it was taking forever to do this district. And then when I downloaded some new assets, I swapped out the middle block for some white ones instead. Wanted it to look a little bit different than everything else around it, and from a distance it did look a bit odd having 3 kind of beige coloured blocks right next to each other. So that is now a white one in the centre, and they house about 26 households each. That's a lot of people. Kind of transitioning into the taller buildings down here. These square assets are really great because you can put them together in different formations, so you'll see a lot of the same buildings being used all around here, but I feel like it's okay because they're always surrounded by different things, so you may not necessarily notice that it's the same building that you've just seen before. The pathways going through the middle was actually for multiple reasons. One of them is so that people can get from one side of a block to another easier without all trying to get down the pavement. But another reason is that these buildings didn't always line up perfectly, and instead of leaving odd gaps, I thought I'd at least make the gaps usable. Some more offices over here with a small amount of commercial, and then back here is a crematorium and a church park from the workshop. And then there's another park down this side because I didn't know where else to put in that gap, and that fit perfectly. Over here is what I like to think is the eco market centre. So this is a tube station under the ground here. It's got this little glass roof detailing on either side, and you can see the trains coming through underneath. So I thought I would surround it with these eco commercial assets. So there's a few markets, some shops, and a few little restaurants. And I like to think that this is where all of the hip and trendy people go because it looks like it's been kind of newly renovated. So I think like Shoreditch kind of area with all of the vegan and vintage stuff. That's what I was kind of going for in this area. There's a few more houses over here because I didn't want to chuck all of the houses on one side of the district. And then there's a park that goes down the back here. All of the gaps in the middle of these blocks are just filled with the concrete painter because having those little ruined edges was looking very, very odd from a distance. So a lot of these blocks just have empty concrete in the middle. So I may go around at some point and do some detailing, but it was just something that I was not willing to do today with how much time I've spent on this build already. But I tried to fill in as many of them as I could with at least something. Down here is the intelligence agency from the high-tech buildings DLC, and then there's a multi-story car park behind it with a little pedestrian road. This is where we really start to get those high-rise buildings coming in. Obviously they're not all high-rise buildings, they do start to really step up at this point. More offices back here, and then this is the luxury hotel unique building. I've never actually used this in a build before because it's so huge and so expensive, and I never really have the right place to use it. So it kind of took up this whole block, and there's a tiny little car park down the back just to fill in the back of the block. There's some smaller offices over here on this corner, a combination of vanilla and eco offices, and then there's some much taller ones over here. This is the same modular high density commercial block that we've used in lots of other places. By the time I got around to this part of the district, I was so out of ideas for what to do, so a lot of these bits might look a little bit odd, but there's a lot of custom assets in this area, like these two buildings here, and this one's from the Art Deco DLC. It's a huge building, and again, I've never used it in any of my builds before because it's just so big, but this was perfect because I wanted this district to have that kind of New York feel, and having all of these Art Deco inspired buildings, both ones from the DLC and ones from the workshop, fit in quite nicely with all of the high-tech and more modern buildings around it. Lots of these Art Deco ones down here. These ones I kind of put together to make two different rows with a pathway going through the middle, and there's lots more tall ones over here. And then there's the Guggenheim Art Museum unique building down here. A lot of these buildings are unique buildings, but I wanted some of them to look more like attractions rather than just office blocks. So there are a couple of things dotted in that aren't necessarily office buildings, but still feel right in a big city. And then it kind of steps down over here again because this is kind of the center of this district. And I wanted to keep that Mediterranean influence in this district, but just have one single nod to it. In my mind, the lore for this district is that this area was filled with these kind of old Mediterranean style buildings, and there was a lot of ruins and a lot of this history still evident on the ground. But the people that came in here thought, we want to build our capital here, so we're just going to bulldoze the whole lot. But we'll keep this one building so that we can kind of honor them in our own way. But they then smush loads of skyscrapers next to it, and it kind of gets lost in all of the busyness. So this is a Mediterranean style cathedral, and it's right next to a monorail station and a whole load of skyscrapers, so you wouldn't even necessarily notice it was there if you weren't looking for it. So around this cathedral, I've kind of made this the center of the district. There is the Lungs of the City unique building here, and I've made like a little market area down here with a few eco-commercial buildings. There's a few market stalls and some cafes and restaurants, and then on the other side there's some from the shopping malls pack, and they all kind of sit around this metro station that's under the ground. This one has 4 entrances, one on each corner, and I can confirm they are all functional. So depending on where the person getting off the train is trying to go to, they'll get out at the most appropriate corner station, and that means there's less people crossing the road on this intersection, which is amazing for traffic because it is starting to get bad, like I said earlier. This is another focal point of this district, hence it being in the centre. It's a very, very, very grand library, unique building. And I don't know if it's based on a real building. I feel like it probably is, but if it is, I don't know which one. So please let me know in the comments if you know which library this is based on. But I love the Art Deco detailing around here, and also you can see into the inside of the building. You can actually see tables and chairs inside the roof of this building. I just love that attention to detail with this asset. And like with many of the others that I've used in this district, I never really get a chance to use it because it's so big. I don't have the population to need more than one library, and it costs a lot of money, so I'm very glad I'm getting to use it in this district. Some small office buildings down the back, and then there's some more residential over here. This residential area is very heavily inspired by New York, with these kind of square buildings with lots of very regimented windows and fire escapes, and they're kind of right in the center of all of the really busy stuff. I like to think that the people who owned these buildings originally kind of banded together and refused to sell their buildings and their land so that developers couldn't come in, which means they still have their little block of red brick buildings and very kind of old style, and they haven't been bulldozed and made into something newer and more modern. Maybe the ones on the end gave in and allowed their land to be bought for these more modern complexes, but the ones in the centre, I like to think that they are either the original owners or descendants of the original owners, and they didn't want to sell their land and they wanted to keep their stake in the centre of the city. There's a couple of very small fire stations down here because they needed some fire coverage up here. And then over this way is a lot more high-rise buildings. These are some really interesting shaped buildings. I think they're meant to go on corners, but I thought I would make a interesting block rather than just doing rectangular ones all over the place. So there's a little pathway that goes through the middle and a park on either side. Lots more commercial and offices over here with a few residential buildings. And then we've got an art museum down here with the really, really fancy primary school. This has a capacity for 2,000 students and it's nearly full because there are so many people in this district. I like to think that this is the area where all of the uber rich people send their kids because there's loads of these really tall, fancy, high-rise flats next to it, looking out over the sea once again. So this, in my mind, is where these super rich people live. And because they're super rich people, they need a driving range. So this is the driving range unique building. It pretty much took up this whole block, so I just put a car park at the end of it. And I like to think that the people on this side of the district are so rich that they could afford to buy out an entire block of this city just to put in a driving range so that they didn't have to travel to get to one. So these people around this side are the rich snobs that pretty much control everything else in the city. More of these modular buildings over here, and then this is a kind of pseudo central park. It's one of the larger park assets with trees from the vanilla catalogue. And then I artificially extended it out the back with more pathways and trees and connected up on either side, because at the end of this block is the Empire State Building asset from the workshop. It is massive. It's the tallest building I think anywhere on this map, and you can see it from miles away. So I didn't want to crowd it with too many other buildings around it. Obviously there's ones next to it, but these aren't anywhere near as tall in comparison. So this park is kind of at the base of this building and gives people space to really appreciate how big it is. And then down here is a baseball field. I've tried to put some office assets around it. This one was really great because it has a diagonal wall, so it actually fit perfectly around this pointed side of the baseball field. And obviously everything back here is empty. I have left that intentionally. I don't want to fill up every single square inch of this place until I know what I'm doing around it, because there may be something that I need to put in the future, and if it's all completely built up, I'll have to bulldoze some stuff and I don't want to do that. And then back here is the very end of this district so far. This again is a kind of pseudo central park. It's got 2 monorail stations on it and a couple of zoo cafes just to give people reason to come down here. Again, the end of this has been left empty intentionally, and that is for the same reason that I left the end of Sunset Heights empty. because later on in the series we're going to be moving over to this island here, and I'm going to need access to these two pieces of land when I do the build on this side of the island. So when it comes to public transport, I've tried to make sure that all of the parts of this district are fairly well covered. There's metro lines running east-west and north-south, both that connect back to the mainland. They actually connect back to the same tube station right outside the train station, so people can get here super easily on public transport in that way. And then there's also 3 inner bus lines as well. There's one bus line that caters to the south and southwest portion of the district, one that caters to the east, and then another that caters to the north. And then obviously we've got the monorail as well that goes around the square at the end, down the central boulevard, and then around this other park down here. I didn't actually go through this monorail park just now, but there are 2 stations, and there's also a tube station down here as well that gets pretty busy, and this station actually sits back in the park rather than over the road. So here is a look at the public transport lines. This yellow route is the north-south line, the green route is the east line, and then the purple route is the north line. Because the bus station sits more onto the west side of the island, I didn't think it was necessary to put a bus line going this way as well. But pretty much everywhere is close to a stop for one of the forms of public transport, apart from this area over here. But those people are rich enough that they don't need public transport. They have their chauffeurs that can drive them around and take them where they need to go. So I thought if anywhere was going to not have public transport, it was going to be the super rich area. This white metro line comes in from the mainland and goes down to the campus area, and this lime green line comes in from the same station but instead goes up through the main city area outside the city hall and up to here. These platforms are fairly busy, but I've tried to keep the lines with the appropriate amount of vehicles on them so that there's not too many people waiting on the station at any one time. So I'd say that this is pretty good compared to some of the other public transport issues we've had recently. The monorail isn't getting anywhere near as much use as I wished it would, but to me it's more of a novelty for tourists than anything, because it kind of just runs down that main road and doesn't really necessarily go to where the people actually live. So I like to think that it's more tourists using this than anything else. Bus routes look like they're getting extremely busy though, so I'm going to have to look at the capacity of the buses and maybe put a couple of more on the lines. But they all come in and go around this station here. It has 2 more stops, so I can add more lines if I need to in the future. So that is my city island build complete. I honestly feel like I've been doing this forever. I've done this over 3 different sessions, and obviously it's still not completely finished because there are gaps around the edge, so I am going to need to come back to it at some point. But this was a very ambitious build for me to do, and I'm very happy with how it's looking now. It looks really great from a distance. So this is from Sunset Heights. And once upon a time, Sunset Heights was the most built up thing on this map, and now it's dwarfed by this huge built up island. Thank you so much for watching if you've made it this far. I think this is probably one of my favourite builds I've ever done in this game, and I'm really proud of what I've done in this district. This in my mind is the capital city of Calathea, so if you've got any name suggestions of what you think it should be, please let me know in the comments. I'd love it to have the same kind of name influence as Calathea, like something from California, something from Spain, something from the kind of Mediterranean area. Let me know if you have any name suggestions and I will pick my favourite. Now that I've got this huge build out the way, I actually have no idea what I'm going to be doing next. There's a few different things that I have left on my list to do, but if you have anything in particular that you'd like to see, let me know, and if it's one of the ones on my list, then I may just do that next. But thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.